Namaskar and welcome to a new episode of the Indology podcast. One of the questions that is being asked quite a bit nowadays is about Pakistan. Whether Pakistan will survive, will Pakistan make 100 years in 2047? Will Pakistan remain in the shape that it is currently? A lot of people have a lot of different theories on the subject. The Pakistanis think that nothing will ever change for them. They're going through a bad time right now, but in no time at all, they'll be back to their usual self. And of course, in no time, they will conquer India and Ghazwa, Hind and all those things. The Indians, many of them, seem to think that Pakistan will nicely and cleanly split into four pieces, Sindh and Baluchistan and Punjab and Pashtunistan, etc. But I disagree with both of them. Will Pakistan remain in the same shape? Let's say by 2047? Probably not. Very likely not. But will it split into very nicely segmented sections? Countries don't split up like that. So I don't think that's going to happen either. But yeah, the idea that Pakistan as a state had no reason to exist is not new. The idea that Pakistan cannot remain together in the shape and the form in which it was created is not a new idea at all. Less than 10 years after the creation of Pakistan, American geopolitical experts were already casting doubts on it. They could not see a valid reason, apart from Western geopolitical interests, because of which Pakistan had a need to exist. And I'll give you one example of that. In 1956, there was an article published in a magazine called The New Republic. It was written by American geopolitical expert Hans Morgenthau. In this article, he writes, "Pakistan is not a nation and hardly a state. It has no justification in history, ethnic origin, language, civilization, or the consciousness of those who make up its population. They have no interest in common except one: fear of Hindu domination. It is to that fear and to nothing else that Pakistan owes its existence." And Morgenthau also went on to predict that the state of Pakistan, in its current shape, will not be able to sustain itself. And his prediction did come true when in 1971, Bangladesh was created out of East Pakistan. Now, many people have many theories why Pakistan will not exist in its current shape. Some talk about sectarian conflicts, some talk about poverty, lack of education, some talk about corrupt politicians. But the real reasons are far deeper than this. They are far more organic than these superficial reasons that are often tossed up. To understand this better, I'm going to read you a passage from a book called Collapsing Pakistan by Dr. N.S. Rajaram. This was written about a couple of decades ago, and it describes in a fantastic detail why Pakistan, at its core, will not remain a country in the future. Pakistan is now a state on the verge of collapse. While world attention is focused on the so-called nuclear flashpoint of Kashmir, the state of Pakistan is being overwhelmed by forces of history and geography. A state with less than a tenth the resources of India, Pakistan is forced to fight insurgencies on its frontiers, perhaps 10 times as great as in Kashmir. It is only a matter of time before the institutions of the state totally break down. And this is because of the fundamental irrationality of Pakistan, which is less a state than a turbulent frontier that a small Punjabi elite is attempting to hold together. Here is what it means in simple terms. While world attention is focused on the proxy war in Kashmir, conflicts far more fierce and fundamental in nature are taking place in the borderlands of Pakistan in the northwest frontier, Baluchistan and Sindh. This has set the state of Pakistan on a course of irreversible dissolution. And this is due to the accumulation of disorder and irrationality that is yet to be understood. And the jihad in Kashmir is a consequence of this fear of a crumbling state in the hope of providing a unifying theme to unite forces of the frontier that are implacably hostile to the Punjabi ruling establishment. The reason is simple. Pakistan is made up mostly of border regions with a small Punjabi core. Pakistan covers the desert frontier of the subcontinent. The British civil administration extended only to Lahore in the fertile Punjab, near Pakistan's eastern border with India. Its Mughal architecture, gardens and rich bazaars gave Lahore a close resemblance to the Indian cities of New Delhi and Calcutta than to any other place in Pakistan. But the rest of the Pakistan, the rugged Afghan border regions of Baluchistan and the northwest frontier province, the alkaline wasteland of Sindh and the Hindu Kush and the Karakoram mountains embracing Kashmir have never been subdued by the British or by anybody else. It's a small chunk of India latched on to a huge and hostile border region. It's a total mismatch. So Pakistan is made up of a vast desert frontier with a small Punjabi core. This unruly desert frontier is what a Punjabi elite and a sprinkling of mujahirs, like the army generals, are trying to rule, while holding up Islam as the unifying force. But this has not made the people on the frontier hate them any less. For Islam always has led to divisions, with each side claiming the other to be less pure. Pakistan's answer to this encirclement was to create the Taliban to control Afghanistan itself. This was facilitated by the war in Afghanistan, which the CIA financed and Pakistani ISI managed. This obscured for a while the fundamental irrationality and the chaos that is inherent in the makeup of Pakistan. The flow of foreign money, especially during the Afghan war, obscured also its economic fragility of the small productive Punjab trying to support the vast, unruly and unproductive frontier. The Cold War and the Afghan War gave Pakistan an exaggerated sense of importance. Pakistani leaders and the elite failed to recognize that they were needed only to do a dirty job that Americans did not want to do themselves. To compound this folly, Pakistan has now embarked on a course of destabilization of India itself. It is difficult to see how an unstable India helps Pakistan any more than an unstable Afghanistan does. But today, Pakistan is a state that is distinguished not by reason but dogma, beginning with its geography. Its belief in Islam as the solution to all its problems has led it to define itself as the jihad state par excellence in the world today. It has made it also the most despised country in the world. It sees spreading terror as its salvation. This bespeaks a mind stupefied by religious dogma to a point beyond reason and logic. This is Talibanism, pure and simple. This has now come back to haunt it in the form of Afghan refugees and lawlessness on a scale that has overwhelmed the Pakistani establishment. And the problem is rooted in history and geography of the region. Foreign aid and rescheduled payments can only prolong the agony. They cannot alter the geostrategic reality or the inherent irrationality of Pakistan's composition. It is also independent of who is in power, the military or a civilian government. The frontier tribes recognize neither. Nor do they care to be ruled by plainsmen from the Punjab, be they Muslim, Hindu, Sikh or the British. This is the basic force of history that the Punjabi ruling elite calling itself Pakistan is fighting against. The outcome of the struggle is a foregone conclusion. It follows a historic pattern. A weak state in the Punjab has always succumbed to forces from the northwest. A strong state of which Punjab is a part has always turned back the invader. So the only hope for its Punjabi heartland to survive is to be part of the strong state of India. With such mighty forces at play, it is clear that a Punjabi Mohajir elite in a slender sliver of land cannot hope to control a vast and lawless frontier. The only natural boundary between this frontier land and the plains is the Indus River, which leaves Pakistan with no strategic depth. The question then becomes one of survival, not exercise of authority. It also shows the futility of India placing trust in any Pakistani leader in the hope of achieving peace in the region. No leader can control either geography or the forces of sectarian hate and violence that dominate the region. It is only a matter of time before the state crumbles under the weight. When that happens, all of Pakistan will become a lawless frontier. The only institutions left in Pakistan will be the madrasas or Islamic schools that turn out something like 500,000 students a year, fit for nothing except jihad. Their first targets will be the elite at home. They're already running the state in Afghanistan and much of Pakistan. Left unchecked, they will soon control all of Pakistan. And the consequences for the region can be cataclysmic, and India should prepare for the inevitable outcome. So here's what India will be faced with in the not-too-distant future. The state we now call Pakistan will be whittled down to Punjab and the regions east of Indus River, struggling to protect itself from the forces of unruly frontiers controlled by warlords great and small in search of loot. This is what institutional meltdown will amount to. By one of those coincidences of history, this institutional meltdown in Pakistan will be paralleled by a meltdown in the Indian intellectual establishment. The behavior of the Indian intelligentsia may be compared to Nero fiddling when Rome was burning. They would rather carry candles to the Wagah border and ask for appeasing the Pakistani establishment than inform the public with a realistic appraisal of the primal nature of the forces of fear and hatred that are burning across the border. It is an unhappy fact that the Indian intelligentsia has offered little more than appeasement of hostile forces in one guise or another. It is worth recalling that Gandhi himself failed with his appeasement policy, not once, but repeatedly, beginning with the Khilafat movement and ending with the partition. The current Indian intelligentsia is unlikely to succeed where Gandhi failed. Thus, the breakdown in Pakistan will be paralleled by a similar breakdown in India. The dogma of jihad has its counterpart in the dogma of appeasement. Fortunately, their days are numbered. The meltdown in Pakistan will consume its advocates in India also. What is needed, therefore, is a new way of looking at the problem, one rooted in ground realities rather than fantasy. Pakistan will not crumble quietly. It is too steeped in hate and violence to disappear like the Soviet Empire. More likely, it will be like former Yugoslavia. Eventually, the land beyond the Indus will return to being the frontier that it has always been, and the Punjabi Muhajir colony, calling itself Pakistan, will be struggling for survival. Its enemy will not be India, but the Talibanized network of schools and its hate-filled students trying to undermine and even destroy the Punjabi elite. To see what it will be like, one has only to look at what happened to the Afghani elite once the Taliban took over. And in Punjab, the hostilities are infinitely greater. They are rooted in the historic hostility of the frontier nomads towards the settled people of the plains. Appeal to Islam will not save them, for what the Punjabis are up against is the geostrategic reality of the region. And this is what has shaped their history, and they have made the situation worse by creating and sponsoring the Taliban. Whenever there was a weak state in the Punjab region, it has fallen before invaders from the northwest. This was the case when it was invaded by Darius, Muhammad of Ghazni, Timur, Babur and Nadir Shah. On the other hand, whenever the Punjab was part of a powerful state, it has turned back the invader. This is what happened when the Greeks, the Huns and the Afghans in the time of Ranjit Singh tried to invade the plains. Saving Punjab is as much India's responsibility as it is Pakistan's. India cannot let these invading forces cross the Indus and turn West Punjab into a wasteland. The only way for Punjab to survive is to let the frontier be frontier and rejoin India, its natural home. But is the Punjabi ruling elite capable of such vision? As one Pakistani Punjabi journalist had said, "We have never defined ourselves in our own right, only in relation to India. That is our tragedy." This attitude represents a historic truth. Punjab is India, or it is a happy hunting ground for the frontier tribes. If the Punjabis do not cure themselves of their hatred, it may soon lead to an even greater tragedy of Afghanistan consuming Pakistan itself. Punjabis should see for themselves that Pakistan is a fantasy that died the day Bangladesh broke away. They should also recognize that the Punjabis never asked for Pakistan. The people who planted that poison seed remained in India. And the same people of the Deoband school also planted the poison seed that grew up to be Taliban. The choice for the Punjabis of Pakistan is clear. Forces of history and geography are against them. They can return to their natural home in India as the proud citizens of a great power, or continue their sordid existence as a client state that can be hired by a patron whenever a dirty job needs to be done. But even this is a precarious and short-lived existence. For all its bombast, Pakistan, its Punjabi core at least, is today little more than a buffer state between India and the violent frontier. Once they become part of India, they will have a great power to defend themselves against the hordes. It is India or oblivion. There is no middle ground. For India, the option is clear. Pakistan as it exists today is facing a meltdown. Changes of government and leaders will not turn back the elemental forces now in play. And negotiations and treaties with a melting state are meaningless. As India becomes a great power, the Pakistani Punjab and the land east of the Indus River will inexorably be drawn into India, and the Indus River will again be its natural boundary. There will be many challenges, but the goal is clear: to minimize the damage and destruction during this historic reunion. In summary, India can no longer afford the luxury of being a soft state, continuing to avoid hard decisions and actions. A soft state at this critical juncture in history may also face a meltdown like Pakistan. Now, I want to remind you that the excerpt that I read to you is from more than 20 years ago. The situation right now in Pakistan is much, much worse. And one of the biggest reasons for this terrible situation in Pakistan is the romantic notion of jihad that a majority of Pakistanis have. And to understand why they have that, we have to go to the root of it, which are the madrasas, the Islamic schools, which are all over Pakistan. And these are the schools where most boys of Pakistan go to. And the most famous madrasa, perhaps in the whole world, is the Madrasa Haqqaniya. I'll read you an excerpt from an article from New York Times, which was published 24 years ago. It gives a very good insight into how madrasas function and how a common Pakistani thinks. About 2 hours east of Khyber Pass, in the northwest frontier province of Pakistan, alongside the Grand Trunk Road, sits a school called the Haqqaniya Madrasa. Haqqaniya is one of the bigger madrasas in Pakistan. Its mosques and classrooms and dorms are spread over 8 acres, and the school currently enrolls more than 2,800 students. Tuition, room and board are free. The students are, in the main, drawn from the dire poor, and the madrasa raises its funds from the wealthy Pakistanis, as well as from devout and politically minded Muslims in the countries of the Persian Gulf. The students range in the age from 8 and 9 to 30 and sometimes 35. The youngest boys spend much of their days seated cross-legged on the floors of airless classrooms memorizing the Quran. This is a process that takes between 6 months and 3 years, and it is made even more difficult than it sounds by the fact that the Quran they study is in the original Arabic language. These boys tend to know only Pashto, the language of the Pathan ethnic group that dominates this region of Pakistan, as well as much of Afghanistan. In a typical class, the teachers sit on the floor with the boys, reading to them in Arabic, and the boys repeat what the teachers say. This can go on between 4 to 8 hours every single day. High school age and college age students are enrolled in an 8-year course of study that focuses on interpretation of Quran and the Hadith, the saying of the Prophet Muhammad. These students also study Islamic jurisprudence and Islamic history. And the oldest of those attending Haqqaniya, the postgraduates, if you will, are enrolled in the Mufti course. A Mufti in Islam is a cleric who is allowed to issue fatwas, or religious rulings, on matters ranging from family law to the rules governing the waging of jihad, or holy war. One room in the school's administration building houses upward of 1 lakh fatwas issued by the madrasa over the years. Very few of the students at the Haqqaniya Madrasa study anything but Islamic subjects. There are no world history courses or math courses or computer rooms or science labs at the madrasa. The Haqqaniya Madrasa is, in fact, a jihad factory. This does not make it unique in Pakistan. There are 1 million students studying in the country's 10,000 or so madrasas, and Islam is at the core of most of these schools. Many madrasas are village affairs with student bodies of 25 or 50. Some of the madrasas are sponsored by Pakistan's religious parties, and some are affiliated with the Mujahideen groups waging jihad against India in Kashmir. Haqqaniya is notable not only because of its size, but also because it has graduated more leaders of the Taliban than any other school in the world, including any school in Afghanistan. The Taliban also seems to harbor a deep belief in the notion of a never-ending jihad, which makes the Haqqaniya Madrasa a focus of intense interest in such capitals as Washington and Moscow and New Delhi and Jerusalem, where the experts are trying to understand just what it is the Taliban and its sympathizers want. At any given time, there are several hundred Afghan students at the madrasa, along with dozens from such former Soviet republics, such as Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, and a handful from Chechnya too. To those who see wars like the one in Chechnya as expressions not only of nationalistic aspirations, but of pan-Islamic ones as well. To those who see a new Islamic revolution on the horizon, a Sunni revolution, a generation after the Shia revolution that shook the world. The majority of Haqqaniya students come from Pakistan itself. Pakistani Muslims are becoming more and more radicalized, Talibanized, some call it, thanks in part to madrasas like Haqqaniya, and Pakistan is showing early signs of coming apart at the seams. Pakistan also happens to be in possession of nuclear weapons. Many Muslims say that they believe that these weapons should become part of the arsenal of jihad. It turns out that many of the Haqqaniya students now believe that too. It is for all these reasons that on a hazy morning in March, I presented myself at the office of the Chancellor of the Madrasa, a mullah named Samiul Haq, in order to enroll myself in his school. My goal was simple. I wanted to see from the inside just what this jihad factory was producing. Maulana Haq is a well-known Islamic scholar with pronounced anti-American views. He's a Deobandi, a follower of an Islamic movement born in India in the days of the British Raj. The Chancellor is a friend and supporter of bin Laden, and he has granted an honorary degree, the first and only in his school's history, to Mullah Omar, the Taliban leader. Samiul Haq is also a politician, a former senator, who today leads a faction of the Jamiat Ulema Islami, a Islamic party seeking to impose Sharia or Islamic law in Pakistan. The Maulana, it is said, would like to see Pakistan become more like the Afghanistan of his Taliban disciples. Because of his views and because he's said to have endorsed a 1998 fatwa issued by bin Laden that called on Muslims to kill Americans wherever they may be found, I was not sure how well we would get along. I was made to wait outside his office for 20 minutes. Students would pass by, shooting me looks ranging from the quizzical to the hostile. Eventually, I was invited in by two of the Maulana's sons, Hamid, who's 31, and Rashid, who's 27, and in charge of designing the madrasa's webpage. We were joined by several of the madrasa's teachers and students, and we made small talk while we waited. The Maulana came into the room in a rush and sat down right beside me. He's a man of 65. He was barefoot, and his toenails looked as if they were covered with rust. He had a long beard, dyed a kind of fluorescent brown, and a loosely wrapped turban sat on his head. He has 2 wives and 8 children, he told me, and he seemed right from the start a very happy man. He dispensed with small talk almost immediately in order to let me know that I should feel at home. The problem, he told me, is not between us Muslims and Christians. The only enemy Islam and Christianity have is the Jews, he said. It was the Jews who crucified Christ, you know. The Jews are using America to fight Islam. Clinton is a good man, but he's surrounded by Jews. I am Jewish, I told him. There was a moment's pause. Well, you're most welcome here, he said, and so I was. The Maulana made me an offer. I could spend as much time as I wanted at the madrasa, go wherever I wanted, talk to anybody I chose, even study the Quran with him. He had a point he wanted to make, of course. His madrasa might be Taliban University, but it was not a training camp for terrorists. Strictly speaking, he was right. I never saw a weapon at the Haqqaniya madrasa. The closest guns could be found across the Grand Trunk Road at the Khyber Pass Armaments Company, a gun store that sells shotguns for $40 and AK-47s for $70. On the other hand, when the Taliban was faring badly not long ago in the battle against the Northern Alliance, Haq closed down his school and sent the students to the front. Classrooms were full when I visited Haqqaniya this spring. For a cramped campus housing so many students, it was most of the time unusually quiet. The hustle and energy of town life never seemed to intrude, and what noise there was mostly came from the Grand Trunk Road just outside the gates of the school, where the horn and not the brake is the driver's primary defense against accident, and buses and trucks compete for space with donkey carts and the occasional camel train. There were no TVs, no radios that I could see. The students woke up before dawn to pray in the madrasa's mosque. The dorms were threadbare and filthy, and there was no cafeteria per se. Students lined up at the kitchen with their plates and spoons and were fed rice and curries and naan. Suffice to say, the students at the madrasa almost never see women. There were no female teachers, no female cafeteria workers, no female presence whatsoever at the madrasa. There is no such thing as a parents' day or family day when mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers come to visit. Like all Pakistanis, the young students are cricket fanatics, and in the late afternoon they would play on a dirt field across the road from the school. There was a dusty patch and a net for volleyball too, but most of the day was devoted to Islam. The youngest students interested me particularly. They had not yet been armored in the hard casing of jihadist ideology, and yet they seemed to incorporate the politics of the madrasa into their play. Two 11-year-old boys, both Afghan refugees who came to the school from Peshawar, would follow me around wherever I went. They wore pots on their heads, and their version of hide and seek was to jump out from behind a tree or some other hiding place, scream Osama, and pretend to shoot me. I tried to learn what I could about these boys, but they were reticent. And my minders, there was usually someone from Samiul Haq's office with me listening in on my conversations, did not want me probing too deeply into how boys came to be students at the madrasa. The youngest boys were kept under lock and key in a 3-story dorm guarded by older students, and I wasn't allowed to see how they lived. The two 11-year-old were refugees, I eventually learned. One of them lost his father in Afghanistan. Their mothers spent their days gathering firewood. They are as poor can be. Compared to a refugee camp, the madrasa is a palace, and they are blessed to be here, where they eat food every single day. No one else, certainly not the government of Pakistan, would provide them with an education, room, and board. During the school day, I would make a special point of auditing classes in which the hadith was studied, because so much of Islamic thought is found in the hadith, and also because the hadith has traditionally been understood to be text open to interpretation, argument, and rigorous intellectual inquiry. But such is not the case at the Haqqaniya Madrasa. In the classes I attended, even the high-level classes of the Mufti course, the pattern was generally the same. A teacher, generally an ancient white bearded mullah, would read straight from a text, and the students would listen. There was no back and forth. It seemed as if rote learning was the madrasa's only style of learning. After a time, I began to be asked questions during classes, questions about America and about my views. One day, in a class devoted to passages in the hadith concerning zakat, I was asked my views about Osama bin Laden. Why did America have it in for him? It is unsettling, to say the least, to be seated in a class being held in a mosque, led by a mullah, and attended by some 200 barefoot and turbaned students, and be asked such a question. A student named Wali said, Osama bin Laden is a great Muslim. The West is afraid of strong Muslims, so they made him their enemy. Osama wants to keep Islam pure from the pollution of the infidels. He believes Islam is the way for all the world. He wants to bring Islam to all the world. When I asked Sayyid, whose brother is a Taliban judge, how his parents felt about his being at the madrasa, knowing there is a chance he might one day fight and die as a mujahid, he replied that they would be so proud. Since the students had turned this day's class into a political seminar of sorts, I decided to ask a question of my own. I brought up the subject of Pakistan's nuclear bomb. I asked the students if they thought it would be permissible by the law of Islam to use a nuclear bomb during the prosecution of a jihad. One student said that all things come from Allah. The atomic bomb comes from Allah, so it should be used. I then asked, who wants to see Osama bin Laden armed with nuclear weapons? Every hand in the room shot up. The students laughed. and some applauded. But I said innocent people would inevitably die if the bomb was used. Even if the West or Russia is subjugating Muslims, does that give bin Laden and his supporters the right to kill innocent people? One student whose name was Ghazi said that Osama has never killed anybody innocent. What if you were shown proof that he did? The Americans say that they have proof, but they don't give it to the Taliban. I then presented a hypothetical scenario. What if you were shown a video in which Osama bin Laden was actually seen murdering a woman? What then? There was a pause. A student named Fazlur Razak stood up. He said, "The Americans have all the tricks of the media. They can put Osama's head on the body of someone else and make it seem like he's killing when he's not doing it." I then took from my notebook my secret weapon, the 1998 fatwa issued by bin Laden's organization, the International Islamic Front for Jihad Against Jews and Crusaders, concerning the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia. I read them a passage, the English translation of which reads as follows. "The ruling to kill the Americans and their allies, civilians and military, is an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it in any country in which it is possible to do it, in order to liberate the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Holy Mosque from their grip, and in order for their armies to move out of the lands of Islam, defeated and unable to threaten any Muslim." Here it is, I said, in black and white. Bin Laden calling for the death of all Americans, civilian and military. "Osama didn't write that," one student yelled, and the others cheered. "That's a forgery of the Americans." I asked one final question, more out of self-interest than anything else. What would you do if you learned that the CIA had captured bin Laden and was taking him to America to stand trial? A student who gave his name as Muhammad stood up. "We would sacrifice our lives for Osama. We would kill Americans." "What kind of Americans?" "All Americans." As I left the mosque, Muhammad and a group of his friends approached me. "We'd like you to embrace Islam," he said. "We love you. We want you to have Islam." Later that day, I met with a small group of students I had grown to like, hoping that away from their teachers, they would talk a different talk. Meeting students out of class had already made for a number of interesting moments. For example, I had been asked for sex, as had been my photographer. Sometimes the propositions were intimated, sometimes they were unusually blunt, especially given the Taliban's official position on homosexuals, which is that they should be killed. Those few students who knew a bit of English seemed most interested in talking about sex. Many of them were convinced that all Americans are bisexual and that Westerners engage in sex with anything, anywhere, all the time. I was asked to describe the dominant masturbation style of Americans and whether American men were allowed by law to keep boyfriends and girlfriends at the same time. A bright and personable student from a village near Kabul told me that his name was Sayyid. His brother, a Taliban judge, had also attended the madrasa. When I had asked Sayyid for his last name, he had said that he would be known as Sayyid Haqqani upon graduation. Many of the students take Haqqani as their last name when they leave the madrasa. I asked him on this afternoon how his parents felt to have him at the madrasa, knowing that there is a chance he would choose to be a mujahid against the Northern Alliance or perhaps against India in Kashmir. "They support the jihad," he said. "How would they feel if you were killed?" "They would be very happy," he said. "They would be very proud. Any father would want his son to die as a shaheed." "If you fought against the Northern Alliance, you would be killing Muslims," I said. "They're Muslims, but they're crazy," Sayyid replied. A couple of days later, I saw the Maulana, and I told him I thought some of his students believed that terrorism under certain circumstances was Quranically acceptable. He frowned and said, "Then you don't understand what we are teaching. There is a great difference between jihad and terrorism." He invited me to eat with him to discuss my inability to comprehend the distinction, but I begged off. I was due in Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan, for a birthday party, and I had promised I would go. It was quite a party, a big cake, lots of speeches, lots of dignitaries, including General Pervez Musharraf, the chief executive of Pakistan, which is the title he took when the Pakistani army overthrew the elected government in October and installed him as the maximum leader. The cake was actually good. It was a vanilla sheet cake, and written in lemon frosting across the length of it were the words "Second Anniversary Celebration of Yawm-e-Takbir." Yawm-e-Takbir can be translated as the Day of God's Greatness. And in Pakistan, it refers to May 28, 1998, the day Pakistan first exploded a nuclear bomb. The birthday party, under the auspices of Pakistan's military leader, was a birthday party for the bomb. Pakistan has fetishized the bomb. In the traffic circles of every sizable city in the country, a full-scale model of the country's homegrown long-range missile stands proud. In Muzaffarabad, in the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, a model of a missile is aimed at India. In 3 cities in Pakistan that I visited, there stand 30-foot-high models of the Chagai Hills, the site where Pakistan exploded its test bombs. And in Islamabad, the monument lights up from the inside at night, all fiery orange to simulate the effect of a nuclear explosion. General Musharraf is not thought of as an Islamic fundamentalist. He is known to have progressive views on the rights of women, for example. And yet he can sound very much like an Islamic fundamentalist at times, like when he began passing the words jihad and terrorism for me. He told me, "There is no question that terrorism and jihad are absolutely different. You in the West are allergic to the term jihad, but jihad is a tolerant concept." General Musharraf himself calls the fight against India a jihad, and the English language newspapers in Pakistan use the language of jihad when talking about the fight. The jihad in Kashmir is of great political help to General Musharraf. In a fractious country like Pakistan, the jihad in Kashmir unifies people the way no other issue does. And so the military junta has given wide berth to the jihad groups training on Pakistani soil. 2 weeks after we met in Rawalpindi, General Musharraf's government announced that it would curb the power of militant groups within Pakistan and bring the madrasa network into conformity with national educational standards. 2 steps that the Americans have been asking him to take nearly from the moment the army seized power. But in our pleasant early morning conversation at the army house, the general did not seem overly concerned about the power of the madrasas. He said, "Very few of these schools are engaged in any kind of militancy. Most of them are very humanitarian. They give food and lodging to these poor boys." He also defended the activities of groups the State Department has labelled terrorists, particularly the Harkatul Mujahideen of Fazlur Rahman Khalil, which is waging a violent jihad against India. It is believed to be behind the hijacking last December of an Indian airliner. The State Department has labelled the HUM, as it is known, a terrorist organization. The group keeps training bases in Afghanistan, but Khalil, its leader, has an office in Rawalpindi, not far from General Musharraf's house, and he moves freely through Pakistan. General Musharraf said, "These people are not terrorists, they are fighting a jihad." 2 days after my interview with the general, I talked to Khalil in Rawalpindi. We met late at night in a dingy office near a bus station and sat shoeless on the floor under a poster depicting the word Allah spelled out in bullets. Khalil told me that he's sorry that his group is thought of as terrorists. "We feel very badly about this," he said. He denied that his group was behind the hijacking of the Indian airliner. A breakaway faction was to blame, he said. And he denied that his group has ever killed civilians in its war in Kashmir. "No one should worry about us," he said. "Only the oppressors of Islam." I asked Khalil, "Would you use nuclear weapons against your enemies if you could?" He said, smiling, "We don't have nuclear weapons. We wish we had nuclear weapons. If we had them, we would use them as necessary. But they're very expensive." Khalil, I was told, would be going to Afghanistan the following day, to Jalalabad, for a meeting with leaders of the other Islamic extremist groups given shelter by the Taliban. Pakistani news reporters the day before our meeting stated that Osama bin Laden was replacing his bodyguards with men from Khalil's group. They were true believers, the report said, who would keep bin Laden safe. And with this, we come to the end of the episode number 21 of the Indology podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it gave you a rather clear picture of how things were in Pakistan 20 years ago, and you can just imagine how they must be right now. So what do you think? Do you think that Pakistan will stay in this shape that it is currently in, or do you think it will split up? What lies in the future of Pakistan? That is the million-dollar question. Please send me your suggestions, your comments, your critique. You can send me a message on Instagram, and you should follow me on all these social media platforms as well. The name is the same, Indologia, Indologia. You can follow my WhatsApp channel, the Telegram group. I'm all over the place. And if you enjoyed listening to this podcast, then please give me a good rating on Apple Podcast, on Spotify, or whichever platform you're listening to this on. Until the next time I see you, Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.